So I don't know about you, but I have always loved trees. I've always thought of them. I've often spoken of them and experienced them in many ways at some deep spiritual level. And I must confess and I must admit that I am a self-professed tree hugger. I don't mean that, maybe not in the way some people talk about tree huggers. It's always surprised me that they see that as a derogatory term. For me, I am literally a tree hugger. I have hugged trees. And you may think I'm strange, but that is the meaning of trees for me. I see trees as a profound witness to the glory, to the presence of God. And I think I've always loved trees since I think I was in junior high, and my family visited the redwood forest in Northern California. Who here has been to the redwood sequoia forest? If you haven't been, it's a bucket list thing to do. If you haven't seen those unbelievable redwood trees and its related cousin, the sequoias, you need to do it. And I remember seeing a tree they've titled it Hyperion, which is actually the tallest tree in the world. 380 feet tall. Which, for you to imagine, that is taller than the Statue of Liberty. That's how tall this tree is. It also has in the same forest one of the largest trees in the world by circumference. It's called General Sherman, and it's only about 275 feet tall, but it's 102 feet wide at its circumference, which means you could drive a semi-trucks through this tree. It's unbelievably amazing how big they are. And then you learn that many of these trees are over 3,000 years old. They had existed long before Christ was born. That's amazing, isn't it, to think about? A living thing that is over thousands and thousands of years old. To see those trees is to be awed by their immensity, by their age. And here's something you may not know, that redwood trees, sequoia trees, actually have roots. You would think that would go very, very deep in the ground, right? That would go deep, as deep, in fact, as tall as they are. There is no taproot for redwood trees. There is that really anchor them into the earth. So you might wonder how it is when in fact their roots go down only about 10 to 12 feet, and yet these trees rarely fall over. They have withstood strong winds, they've withstood earthquakes, they have experienced fires and storms, prolonged flooding, and yet they live. How can something up to 500 tons, reaching over 300 feet in height, live for many centuries? How can it remain standing with the roots only going as deep as 10 feet? Does anyone know? Susan? Yeah. She's exactly right. That they go down below and connect and hold on to the rest of the redwood trees. Think about that. They hold each other up. And I cannot help but think, is not this wisdom of this tree something to teach us about how we humans, part of this amazing, great creation, must realize for us to grow, for us to prosper, we also have to hold each other up. And if we forget that, we've lost ourselves. Last week I shared that John Calvin, you probably have heard of him and not sure you really like him, but he is kind of our spiritual grandfather theology. Has been assigned some ideas that he would reject, but Calvin is, in kind of some ways, our theological grandfather. And I shared last week that he wrote a great line in which he talked about how creation was actually the theater of God's glory. That this creation was this amazing thing that can tell us about who God is and how God calls us to be in the world. And for me, those trees I saw at a young age, that experience of awe, that glimpse in some ways of God's timeless glory has always stayed with me. And in truth, my experience is that every tree I have seen since then, whether it's in my backyard or on a walk or going to the park, the dog park especially, every tree I have seen becomes a glimpse to me of God's glory. Something to be embraced, something to be celebrated. And every tree I pass, I offer a prayer of thanksgiving. Now, the Bible is filled with images of trees as witnesses to God's presence, as witnesses to God's glory. The very verses we started our worship with from Jeremiah, that was our call to worship, is just such an example. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust in the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes. Its leaves shall stay green. Even in the year of drought, it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. It's amazing words. That we be like trees, that even in times with our roots rooted deeply in the earth and reaching out to the things that feed us, and even in times of drought, which we all know, we still bear fruit. Trees are everywhere in the Bible, from the Psalms to the Gospels to the very beginning of Genesis. What was planted in the middle of the Garden of Eden, does anyone know? The tree of life. And the text we read this morning, Doug, go ahead and pull the text up again if you will, is just such an example. When the poor and needy seek water and there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst, I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. It's always interesting, you may not pay attention to this in the scriptures, that always God is the first to lift up the poor and needy. In this case, the Hebrew people in exile in Babylon, but always over and over prophetically, it is the poor and needy that God especially takes care of. But it's also an image in which every single one of us have had experiences, haven't we? In which we feel deep poverty, feel deep need, a sense in which we are very, very thirsty for something more. Go ahead to the next one. I will open rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land of springs of water. That even in those times in our life when we find ourselves lost in the wilderness, even in the times of our life in which we cannot imagine water welling up, God is there to quench our thirst, to care for us. I went earlier this year to Israel, Palestine, and it's the first time I've been to that country, but what struck me, for those who've been, can speak to this, how dry it is. It's a desert. So these words are profoundly meaningful for the people hearing them. And then, and this seems like, boy, how is this connected? I will put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I will set in the desert the cypress, the plane, and the pine together. God is planting trees. And what strikes me about this, it isn't just one kind of tree, is it? So actually the whole point of it, isn't it? All these different kinds of tree, the cedar, the acacia, I don't even know what these are, the myrtle, the olive tree. I will set it in the desert, the cypress, the plane, and the pine. It's almost, if you go to the next part of this, so that all may see and know, all may consider and understand that the hand of the Lord has done this, the Holy One of Israel has created it. In other words, this diversity of trees is an indication of God. Diversity is an indication of God. So that all may know. I mean, it's interesting. We sometimes think of diversity as simply a cultural concept, but if you look at creation around us, the way God made the world, it's diverse. In fact, an ecosystem cannot prosper, cannot come alive unless there is diversity. Plants, of creatures, a balance of many different things. And the writer, the prophet's making this point that diversity is a sign of God's presence. Think about that. Now we have, as Susan pointed out, as a mission committee, we put a sign outside about our welcome to others, and it's not simply though primarily driven in many ways by our commitment to the idea of diversity, our commitment to create something, to create a community that is diverse. And we believe that is a reflection of the gospel, of God's love for all creation. It's a reflection of the splendor of God's glory around us. Diversity is a good thing. But it is also driven by this truth, that we gain life from this diversity. We are enriched by this diversity. It is not simply our welcome and outreach to diverse people, but it is a belief that if they are a part of us, we are made better. Maybe if we talked about the gifts of immigrants more, the diversity, we would realize how much more they make our communities better. Right? If we but embrace that diversity, not as some politically correct idea, but flowing out of our welcome, out of our sense of who we're supposed to be, but even more than that, realizing that they make us better. That in many ways, we become rooted together and we hold each other up. There's a book written by a scientist. She was a forestry, Susan Simard. I think she called it Looking for the Mother Tree. And she was a scientist, a forest person who studied forestry. And she actually worked for lumber companies. She actually worked in order to try to create healthy forests that can rebound so that we still can use the resource and yet make it sustainable. And it had been, she was a woman working in a man's field, professor, and in many ways, kind of the thought at the time was, well, what we need to do is just plant all the trees the same. It's just that actually the trees will prosper better if we all, and this is actually the ways in which our forestry, United States forestry, operated. Well, we'll just plant all oaks, and that'll be better, and then we can, let them grow, and we'll plant all maples over here, or different trees. And what she did is she discovered that actually that was so untrue. That you actually needed to mix a diverse community of the forest. And what she discovered and what she articulated, and in some ways it created a stir in science of forestry, is that actually all these trees are connected at the root level by mycelium, by, what is mycelium? Feelers, right. These fungus is what the word I was looking for, that they're connected at a fungal level, and that if you map out how all these trees are connected at this fungal level, and that actually, when you look at a forest, you're seeing a community of creatures communicating with each other, warning each other. And they worried that taller trees were preventing sunshine from hitting shorter trees, and what they discovered was actually the taller trees communicating with the smaller trees were actually communicating, and the taller trees would move out of the way. And again, this was a provocative thesis that people were shocked by, more and more realizing the aliveness of a forest. God, there's wisdom if we but look and pay attention. So put up the poem, Doug. I've been sharing poems each week, kind of as a preparation for worship. For those online, you've not been able to really look at it. I included it in the bulletin. You can take it home. And these poems each week reflect somewhat the theme of that worship that day. And they are always Mary Oliver, who I think of as the most profound theologian of nature that I know. And part of the reason I loved Mary Oliver is she wrote a whole book of poems about dogs. So, and that made her special to me. But she wrote this poem. When I am among the trees, especially the willows, the honey locust, equally the beech, the oaks, and the pines, they give off such hints of gladness. I would almost say that they save me in daily. I am so distant from the hope of myself, in which a hope of myself in which I have goodness and discernment, a hope of myself in which I never hurry through the world, but walk slowly and bow often. Around me the trees stir in their leaves and call out, "Stay a while." The light flows from their branches, and they call again. It's simple, they say, and you too have come into the world to do this, to go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine. So if you're not up to hugging a tree this week when you see one, I'd ask you to do what Mary Oliver asked you to do, to bow. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.